The Joe Rogan Experience.
I want to get to Egypt because I think it's one of the most bizarre accomplishments of human beings. And the age of Egypt is a fascinating piece of discussion because whatever it is, one of the more fascinating things is Robert Schoch out of Boston University, the geologist who examined the erosion in the Temple of the Sphinx and determined it to be thousands of years of rainfall, and which would predate the Sphinx by quite a bit, because this is all stone that had been moved by human beings, and it had been used to construct the Sphinx. And this temple, the Sphinx, had been carved out. It's very clear that it was carved out. And you see these massive fissures that look exactly like water erosion. He specifically said that he showed these images to other geologists without telling them what they were looking at. And they almost unanimously said that it was water erosion over thousands of years of rainfall. And then when he would show them exactly what he was telling them to describe, then they didn't want to have any part of it, because it's like, okay, now you're saying something that's really crazy, because now you're saying that this structure is 11,000 years old as opposed to 4,500 years old.
Surprise, surprise, I'm going to disagree with you.
Shall we look at...
Well, it's not me. It's Robert Schoch.
No, Robert Schoch.
Shall we look at some images of the Sphinx?
Let's look at images of the water erosion, because it's...
And then I'll show some images of the quarries nearby.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So if you could hook me up again, Jamie, to the HDMI. And again, credit to my wife, Santa, who has taken every risk with me, every step, every dive for the last 30-plus years. This is her aerial photograph of the Sphinx enclosure and of the Sphinx temple, so-called.
How'd she get that picture?
In a helicopter.
Wow.
Huh. Back in, the mid-90s somewhere. Sphinx temple directly in front of the Sphinx, so-called, and the Valley temple to the left as we view it. And you can see that the Sphinx is a rock-hewn structure cut out of the bedrock with a trench around it. And if we go in here, the notion that the Sphinx bears the marks of precipitation-induced weathering is an evolution of an idea that the late, great John Anthony West had many, many years ago. You've had John on your show before
twice.
He passed away.
Yeah.
He was a dear friend of mine.
He was great. Magical Egypt. I can't recommend it enough. It's such a fascinating
material.
He has two of them, two series. I think there's like 3 DVDs in each one, and it's just incredible stuff. Just on the undisputable things about the construction methods and how fascinating it is that they built these things.
Marvelous, out-of-the-box thinker. I miss him so much. He was a dear
amazing
friend. It was he who brought Robert Schoch to the Giza Plateau. And Robert took a look at the erosion around the Sphinx and eventually came to the conclusion that the best explanation for it was that this Sphinx enclosure had been subjected to at least 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Robert Schoch right now puts that back to around the 10,000 BC date, 12,000 plus years ago, during the Younger Dryas, when indeed there were heavy rains in Egypt. And it's these deep vertical fissures in the side of the enclosure wall which most clearly demonstrate what he's talking about, that rainwater pouring off the edge of the plateau would have selectively cut out the softer areas of rock and created these fissures that we see through it, and this rounded, scalloped profile in Robert Schoch's view and in mine.
I've had Robert Schoch on as well.
Yeah.
We talked about it for a long time.
And I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch here. He and I have had our differences, but Robert Schoch, in my view, is a hero. Robert Schoch is a mainstream academic who has stuck his neck out for an idea that is very unpopular with mainstream academics. He's taken all the risks for his career, he's put himself out there, and he's spoken his truth. And I want to respect Robert Schoch. I want to express that respect and kudos to Robert Schoch for everything he's done. He's helped to advance this field enormously and to allow people to think previously unthinkable thoughts.
And I've seen him attacked mercilessly.
Mercilessly. This happens again and again with archaeologists, unfortunately.
So
I'll just complete this point, because it's often said that the Sphinx was the work of the pharaoh Khafre, and that these two temples were the work of the pharaoh Khafre, particularly the Valley temple that we see on the right there. There's no inscriptions in the Sphinx temple, but when we come to the Valley temple, what we're looking at is a limestone core, and those limestone blocks were actually taken out of the Sphinx trench, which was then faced in a later time with granite. And there's a quote from Robert Schock there, who's saying that basically the original temples were limestone, and that they were faced with granite. Now, that's the interior of the temple. You can see that there's definitely two phases of construction there. There's the granite, no dispute that that's Old Kingdom Egypt. And then there's the limestone massive megalithic walls behind it, which are heavily eroded, as you can see even from here. Now, interestingly, is that temple really associated with the pharaoh Khafre? In 1947, I.E.S. Edwards, who was one of the leading Egyptologists of his time, wrote this: "Around each doorway is a band of hieroglyphic inscription giving the name and titles of the king. No other inscriptions or relief occur anywhere else in the building." That's been taken to assume that the name of the king was given as Khafre. Actually, Edwards corrected himself in 1993. Around each doorway was carved a band of hieroglyphic inscription giving the name and titles of the king, but only the last words, beloved of the goddess Bastet and beloved of the goddess Hathor, are preserved. No other inscriptions occur anywhere else in the building. In other words, there's nothing in that temple that directly connects it to the pharaoh Khafre. But what's interesting is the way that granite facing, which certainly was done in the Old Kingdom, has actually been, the interior of the granite has actually been cut to match the heavily weathered limestone that it's covering. It's been cut to shape that. They're honoring and respecting that ancient structure. And so, in my opinion, the geological evidence on the antiquity of the Sphinx is strong. There's no doubt that the ancient Egyptians were there, that they did work on the Sphinx. The head of the Sphinx was recarved into a human head. I and my colleagues believe it was originally the head of a lion, that the Sphinx was an entire lion.
But the evidence that it's been carved is that it has far less erosion than the rest of the body, correct?
And also the head is way out of proportion to the rest of the body. That's an issue, because one thing the ancient Egyptians were pretty good at when they put their minds to it was proportion.
Yeah.
And the disproportionate size of the head of the Sphinx in relation to the whole body of the Sphinx.
I mean, if you look at other ancient Egyptian sphinxes, they also have small heads. If you put my head on a lion, it would look small. And they all look relatively small.
Indeed, it would look small. That's the point. It was a lion before, and it was cut. It was heavily eroded, and it was then cut down into a human head.
But it does have a distinctly different form of erosion.
No, that's actually where I'd come and disagree with you. I have some photos as well.
What's your evidence that it was connected to Khafre?
The head. Oh, yeah, and I can show you why.
Way
yeah,
less
because
eroded.
it's a different stratum of the natural limestone.
I see.
So if you look at the geology of the area, are you finished, Graham? If not, I'll put up some slides.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, let's do this. So first off, I want to sort of show this is what it looks like, even the neck. You don't see the neck today because because they expanded the headdress as a support for the head. And so the point is that there's these different layers of this limestone here that we can understand geologically. And so there's this very dense limestone that's up by the head, and then the rest of the limestone is much more fragile and porous. So I do want to be clear, how do we date the Sphinx? What kind of evidence archaeologically are we using? Mm-hmm. And so what that comes from is largely radiocarbon dates from the pyramids themselves. So pieces of wood that were in between the blocks of the pyramids have been radiocarbon dated and definitively tell us that the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, right?
But didn't they do work on the pyramids at multiple stages where they would probably like reseal things and surface things and clean things? If they were constructed 12, 13, 20,000 years ago and people were still inhabiting them 5,000 years ago, wouldn't it make sense that they would do things to them?
Well, we have inscriptions in there from areas that are sealed off from the actual construction, graffiti from the workmen referring to, for example, Friends of Khufu and different workmen gangs that are in there. And these are in areas...
It's graffiti like they tagged
it? They tagged it, exactly.
You know that particular graffiti in the Khufu cartouche has long been suggested as a forgery by Howard Vyse.
Except it uses versions of Khufu's name that were not known until later by scholars. And so that's
what versions are those?
I don't know, man. I don't read hieroglyphs.
Where'd you get that information?
Egyptologists.
Where'd you get that information from?
I got
Zawi
that.
Hawass.
No, not from Zahi Hawass. I've never met Zahi Hawass. I got that information from reading, man. But okay, so let's go back. How do we know that these radiocarbon dates with the blocks in the pyramid relate to the Sphinx itself? Because the Sphinx is just hewn out of natural stone, right? These different layers here. So the reason we know is because geochemists have done stone sourcing on the chemistry of these stones in the pyramids. And they've been able to trace them to different quarries at Giza. And so this is photos of different quarries and cuttings for the quarries. And so they've taken samples from the quarries themselves and from the stones in the pyramids. They do different kinds of geochemical analyses to show the ratios of, in this case, magnesium and iron. And then they trace them back to specific quarries there. And so they know that a bunch of the stones from Khafre, for example, come from the area of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is from a quarry. It's a quarry site for those stones. And so one of the things...
Go back to that slide for a second.
Yeah.
We're cut into the quarry walls. Okay.
And so this is a photo of some of these quarries, and I want to point out that the quarry walls look a lot like exactly the walls of the Sphinx itself. It has the same kind of erosion on it. It has the same kind of rough working on it. And so what you're actually seeing with the Sphinx is you're seeing this roughened shape from quarrying, which is then built with nicer stones around it.
Right, but we're talking about the temple, the Sphinx, the outside structure is what Robert Schoch was discussing. That shows much more clear indication of the water erosion. Not necessarily this, which shows a lot of kind of different erosion.
And by the way, this restoration on the paws of the Sphinx is modern.
Yes, that is
yeah,
modern. I'm not going to deny that. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that we can't... A, I don't think that anybody really agrees with Schoch that it is erosion. B... If it is erosion, a lot of geologists do not, nor do many
geologists do. Many geologists do agree with them.
Very few.
I think it's quite a bit. Graham, you would know more than I do.
I think it's quite a bit too, but it doesn't really matter to me. I think whether geologists agree with him or not, whether archaeologists agree with him or not, he's spoken his truth, he's made his case, and I think it's a strong and compelling case.
And what I'm trying to do is present the evidence that goes against him, right?
But when you look at those fissures that are in that wall...
You see the same thing on quarries there. You know, it's the same exact kind of fissures on this is just a completely different quarry in a different area of Giza.
That's not the most specific example of it, though. If you could show other examples of that wall.
And so, I mean...
There's other examples of that wall that are much more rounded out.
So I have been to Giza, by the way.
See, this just doesn't look the same to me.
Wait, but I have a reason for saying that. I've been to Giza. The one time I went to Giza, it rained. In fact, the taxi got into an accident because the oil on the road got so slick that we were hit from behind.
Right, it does rain.
Very minor fender bender, but the point
but
is...
you're not denying
but
that the climate radically changed in that area.
How do you date erosion like this? That takes a lot of experimentation, and I've seen no evidence that shows how to date this kind of erosion to 12,000 years ago or something like that.
Are you in control of the thing now? Is that what's
I
going
am,
on?
and I was going to show
Graham, can you show images from what you were looking at when it shows the water erosion? Because it looks very different. The images that Graham was showing from where Robert Schoch did his work, it's much more extreme. The ones that you have are from a distance, and the other ones are kind of blurry, and you're looking at it, and it looks similar. But like
I was there in 2003, so it's been a long time.
I'm sure you were. But this is different. The fissures in there are different. They really look like water flow. And if you're talking about the different layers of stone, which are softer in some layers and harder in other, if you did have that kind of water flowing through it, it would make sense that the softer layers would be more eroded. And that's Robert Schoch's contention.
And how are you going to date that, though, to however long ago? One of the other key
But don't you date it though by the amount of rainfall that we know took place at a certain time?
Because a small amount of rainfall can also cause erosion, especially in a dry environment. So in very dry environments, a tiny amount of rainfall can actually damage things even worse because things are so dry.
But that level of erosion?
Well, but you need to come up with some independent way of dating it, right? And that's where the issue is. What we do have is independent confirmation that the blocks in the pyramids came from the quarry right there.
Right.
And we have dates on those blocks from radiocarbon dates of wood in between those blocks.
There's an area where my work is misunderstood. I strongly support Robert Schoch on the 12,000-year-old dating of the Sphinx and of the megalithic temples in front of the Sphinx. I've never claimed that the pyramids are 12,000 years old.
Oh, I know it didn't say you
I
have.
didn't say
I
you
know
did
some
either.
people do,
Yeah.
though.
Some people do.
Yeah, some people do.
I've never claimed that. I do not seek to divorce the ancient
That is
Egyptians
why I brought up
from
the
the Great
notion
Pyramids.
that they'd been resurfaced, because that's
Yeah.
the claim.
Yeah, I've heard that claim as
That
well.
people had been living in them for thousands of years, and so that the material that you're dating is from that time period.
Yeah.